The Big Lie: How to Enslave the World. The Hidden Psychology of Control and Obedience. What if everything you've been taught to believe about truth, authority, and your own voice was shaped by silence? In a world built on quiet compliance and distorted narratives, even the smallest act of honesty can become revolutionary. This video is not just about exposing systems of control. It is about uncovering the quiet power within you, the part that dares to see, to question, to live with clarity. Stay with us, because what comes next might not only shift your view of the world, it may reconnect you with the self you thought you had to leave behind to survive. You're not alone in sensing something's off, and you don't need to shout to make a change. Sometimes the most powerful transformation begins in stillness. Let's begin there. Lies the air that envelops an entire society. In a society saturated with falsehoods, lies no longer feel foreign. They become the background noise of our lives, the air we breathe without noticing. Over time, truth itself fades, not because it disappears, but because it becomes indistinguishable from deception. We no longer question what is real, because reality is now defined by repetition and control. In such an environment, those who still cling to truth often feel isolated, even insane. They are labeled as troublemakers, outsiders, or naive idealists. But how does a society descend into such confusion? It rarely happens suddenly. It begins with small compromises, silent acceptance, looking away just once. And when those small acts become normalized, they lay the foundation for something far more dangerous: a collective illusion upheld not by violence alone, but by quiet compliance. People begin to live double lives. Publicly, they nod, smile, and repeat what is expected. Privately, they doubt, suffer, and slowly disconnect from their own sense of self. This is not just a political phenomenon. It is deeply psychological. Living within lies corrodes inner integrity. It separates thought from speech, heart from action. It turns human beings into shadows of who they could be. And yet many stay silent, afraid to disturb the comfort of the collective trance. What if speaking up means losing everything? What if silence means losing ourselves? To understand such a society is to understand its people. Their silence is not always agreement. It is often exhaustion, fear, or learned helplessness. The human mind adapts to survive, but in doing so, it sometimes forgets how to live. Healing begins not by confronting the system first, but by confronting the part of ourselves that accepted the lie. Only then can we find clarity, connection, and the quiet strength to live authentically in a world that desperately needs truth. Fiction takes over when the whole world is manipulated. When fiction replaces fact on a societal scale, truth is not merely hidden. It is rewritten. A new narrative is imposed, one that demands belief, not because it is logical or proven, but because it is repeated until it becomes reality. This is how systems of control strengthen their grip. They create a world in which people no longer rely on their senses or conscience, but on what they are told to see and feel. Statistics are altered, language is corrupted, and the past is reshaped to justify the present. Those who resist are labeled unstable, extreme, or dangerous. At first, the shift is subtle. Words change meaning. History becomes selective. Reality bends just enough to go unnoticed. But as the fiction expands, it begins to absorb everything: education, art, media, even personal relationships. The world becomes filtered through a false lens, and anyone who refuses to wear it becomes a threat. The system does not just silence truth, it teaches people to fear it. This manipulation does not require open violence. It thrives on participation. People adapt not always out of loyalty, but out of fear of isolation. They learn what to say and what to avoid. They teach their children to do the same. Over time, truth becomes private and hidden, while lies dominate the public space. A culture of pretense grows, one where authenticity is risky and silence becomes survival. But the cost is high. When fiction becomes reality, individuals lose their ability to think clearly and feel deeply. Conscience is dulled. Empathy fades. The soul shrinks. A society built on falsehoods cannot foster genuine human connection. It breeds suspicion, conformity, and spiritual decay. To reclaim truth, we must first recognize the weight of what we have accepted as normal. Only by seeing through the illusion can we begin to reconnect with ourselves, with each other, and with a deeper sense of what it means to be human. Not just victims, we have also been silent. In every totalitarian system, the narrative often paints the people as passive victims of an oppressive regime. But this image is incomplete. Oppression does not grow in a vacuum. It requires the quiet approval of the many. It thrives on the silence of those who know better but say nothing. When fear replaces truth and comfort is chosen over courage, A society begins to rot from within. And this decay is not imposed entirely from the outside. It is maintained by the small daily choices of those who prefer safety to responsibility. It is easy to blame leaders and institutions, but power is rarely taken by force alone. It is offered little by little through apathy, denial, and the avoidance of conflict. When people accept lies to protect their comfort, they help build the very structure that will later imprison them. History is not shaped only by tyrants. It is also shaped by neighbors who look away, by friends who stay silent, and by citizens who choose not to see. This realization is painful. It demands that we look inward, not just outward. It asks us to confront our own role in allowing falsehood to spread. Did we laugh off injustice? Did we stay silent to avoid discomfort? Did we teach our children to speak up or to stay quiet to stay safe? These are not questions of guilt, but of awakening. For healing to begin, we must first accept how we have been complicit. Understanding this dynamic allows us to reclaim agency. It reminds us that even in the darkest systems, people have a choice. Not all resistance must be loud. It can begin with a simple act of honesty, a refusal to participate in something false. And from these small acts, larger movements can grow. The silence that once protected the lie can be replaced by the quiet strength of truth. The transformation of a society always begins with the transformation of its individuals. Silent resistance begins from within. The first battle against falsehood is not fought in public squares or shouted across headlines. It begins quietly deep inside the human soul. It begins when a person chooses not to betray their own conscience. In a world shaped by pressure to conform, this decision is revolutionary. When someone refuses to repeat what they know to be untrue or chooses not to act in a way that contradicts their values, they are no longer silently serving the lie. This form of resistance is often invisible to others. There are no speeches or protests. There is only the quiet refusal to participate in the fiction. It may look small, even insignificant, but in truth, it is a first step toward freedom. For the structure of oppression, though outwardly powerful, depends entirely on internal submission. When the submission ends within even a single person, a crack begins to form in the system. Such resistance does not require perfection. It requires honesty. It asks us to observe our lives and notice where we have made peace with lies. Are we silent when we see something wrong? Do we pretend to believe what we do not? Do we protect ourselves by pretending not to see? Facing these questions is not easy. It brings discomfort and sometimes fear. But through this discomfort, something begins to awaken. The courage to live truthfully grows not in isolation but in connection. As one person chooses to live with integrity, others begin to feel less alone. Quiet acts of truth ripple outward. They inspire, encourage, and gently challenge those still trapped in fear. What seems like a solitary act becomes a shared awakening. And this shared awakening is how change truly begins. Not through force, but through a return to what is real. In the silence of self-awareness, a new kind of resistance is born, one that no system can fully suppress. Living truthfully, a small act of courage. To live truthfully in a world built on deception is an act of quiet defiance. It does not demand grand gestures or public declarations. It asks only that we stop pretending, that we stop nodding along with what we do not believe, that we stop performing roles we no longer recognize. Living truthfully does not mean becoming loud or confrontational. It means aligning our inner world with our outer actions. It means returning to a place within ourselves where integrity still lives. This form of courage often looks ordinary. It may be as simple as refusing to laugh at a cruel joke or choosing not to echo empty slogans. It might mean asking questions when silence is expected or speaking gently when anger is demanded. These acts may seem small, but they are not insignificant. In fact, they are radical in a world that rewards conformity. When someone lives truthfully, they become a mirror that reflects what others have forgotten. They remind us of our own buried convictions. There is risk in truth, rejection, misunderstanding, even isolation. But there is a greater risk in surrendering to the lie. It erodes our sense of self. It replaces honesty with shame and courage with fear. Over time, the soul becomes numb. We stop feeling, stop caring, stop seeing clearly. And in that numbness, life loses its meaning. Living truthfully is not just about resisting a broken system. It is about restoring ourselves. It is about remembering that we are not here to perform, but to live. To love without pretense. To speak without disguise. To act without betrayal. The truth is not a weapon to be used against others. It is a way back to ourselves. And every small choice to live honestly is a step toward healing, not just for us, but for everyone watching, waiting and hoping for something real. A band and the alarm that awakened a society. Sometimes change begins in the most unexpected places. In Czechoslovakia, during a time when music was censored and expression tightly controlled, a small rock band refused to conform. The plastic people of the universe did not set out to lead a revolution. They only wanted to create freely, to play music that felt real. But in a system built on control, even honesty in art became a threat. Their refusal to comply led to arrests. The state labeled them as unstable, dangerous, and corrupting. But something strange happened. The public began to pay attention. People who had grown tired of pretending recognized something true in the band's defiance. It was not about the music. It was about the courage to live authentically in a world that punished truth. The trial that followed became more than a legal battle. It became a mirror for a society suffocating under lies. In supporting the band, citizens were not just defending artists, they were defending their own silenced voices. They were saying enough. They were choosing to remember what dignity felt like. This was the quiet beginning of a cultural shift, one that would eventually lead to the Velvet Revolution. What began as a concert turned into a call for freedom, carried not by weapons, but by integrity. The story of this band reminds us that resistance can take many forms. It does not always come from politicians or leaders. Sometimes it comes from artists, teachers, parents, or even from those who never asked to be symbols. Their power lies not in their status, but in their refusal to betray what is real. And when enough people recognize that same desire within themselves, a collective awakening becomes possible. A society begins to change when even one small voice chooses truth over silence. Totalitarianism, strong on the outside, fragile within. Totalitarian regimes often appear powerful, unshakable, and deeply rooted. They surround themselves with symbols of strength, military parades, strict rules, and an illusion of order. But beneath the surface lies a different truth. These systems are not strong because they are just or wise. They are strong because they rely on fear and lies to survive. And anything that must be constantly protected by suppression is not stable. It is fragile. The strength of totalitarianism depends entirely on the weakness of the individual. When people are afraid to speak, when they hide their doubts and silence their pain, the system grows. But this growth is not sustainable. It is built on control, not trust, on fear, not respect, on silence, not consent. This is why even a single act of truth can cause disruption. Not because it is loud, but because it reveals the illusion. It shows that the emperor is not invincible, that the system for all its size is hollow at its core. Every lie requires maintenance. Every false story must be constantly defended. That is why totalitarian regimes fear artists, thinkers, and anyone who chooses truth. They fear not the person, but the possibility that others might follow. A single voice speaking clearly can echo further than the loudest propaganda. The moment someone stops playing the game, the rules begin to crack. What seemed like stone now feels like glass. Understanding this gives hope. It reminds us that no matter how strong a system appears, it is still vulnerable to honesty. It cannot survive without our participation. The silence that supports it is also what can end it, not through violence, but through the quiet withdrawal of obedience. When fear loses its grip and truth finds a voice, even the mightiest illusion can fall. The power of truth lies not in how loudly it is spoken, but in the courage to speak it at all. One individual can shake an entire system. It is easy to believe that one person cannot make a difference. Systems of control thrive on this belief. They teach us that resistance is futile, that we are too small, too alone, too powerless to challenge anything. But history repeatedly tells a different story. Great changes often begin with a single voice, a single act of refusal, a single moment of clarity. One person choosing truth can awaken something dormant in many others. When someone lives with conviction, others notice. They may not speak, but they feel it. That quiet integrity, that refusal to compromise becomes a signal. It reminds people of what they once believed before fear taught them to forget. And slowly a shift begins. What felt impossible starts to seem inevitable. Not because the system has changed, but because people have begun to see through it. True influence does not require fame or status. It requires courage. The courage to live without pretending to act, without fear to speak, even when the voice trembles. This kind of courage breaks patterns. It interrupts the cycle of silence. It creates space for others to follow. And once that space exists, the illusion of power begins to weaken. There is strength in numbers, but all numbers begin with one. One person who chooses not to lie. One person who decides not to look away. One person who quietly lives in truth. The weight of that choice is heavier than we think, because it challenges the foundation of the entire structure. And when the foundation shakes, everything built upon it begins to crack. This is how real transformation begins. not with noise or violence, but with quiet acts of honesty. A life lived in truth is not just a personal victory. It is an invitation. It says to others, you are not alone. You do not have to pretend. And together, what once seemed untouchable begins to fall. Silence is also a form of complicity. Not all harm is done by action. Sometimes the deepest wounds are caused by silence. In oppressive systems, silence becomes a strategy for survival. People convince themselves that staying quiet protects them, that turning away is not the same as supporting the lie. But silence over time becomes consent. It becomes the invisible thread that holds the system together. And the longer we remain silent, the more we become part of the very thing we fear. Silence often begins with fear. Fear of punishment, of rejection, of standing alone. These fears are real and understandable, but they do not absolve us. Every time we choose not to speak, not to act, we strengthen the illusion that no one cares, that everyone agrees, that nothing can change. The lie survives not only because it is told, but because it is not challenged. And in our quiet, the lie gains power. This is not a call to blame, but a call to awaken, to recognize the cost of our silence, not just to ourselves, but to those around us. When we do not stand up for others, we slowly surrender our own voice. When we allow cruelty to go unchallenged, we erode our own humanity. Silence may feel safe, but it steals our clarity, our strength, and ultimately our freedom. Breaking silence does not require shouting. It begins with honesty. It begins with small acts of courage, with choosing to see, to care, to speak, even when it is uncomfortable. And when one person breaks the silence, others feel less alone. One whisper becomes 2, then 10, then a wave. The system that once felt unbreakable starts to tremble, not from force, but from truth, finding its voice. In the end, we must choose where we stand, with fear and quiet submission, or with truth and the courage to speak. The psychology of obedience, why we're easily led. Obedience is often seen as a virtue. From childhood, we are taught to listen, to follow rules, to respect authority. In many cases, this serves a healthy purpose, helping societies function and people live in harmony. But what happens when obedience is demanded not to uphold truth or justice, but to preserve control and silence? Psychology has long explored this question. Studies show that people are more likely to obey authority even when it conflicts with their values. Fear, social pressure, and the desire to belong all play a role. In many systems, obedience is rewarded while questioning is punished. Over time, individuals learn to suppress their inner doubts. They begin to confuse conformity with morality and loyalty with silence. This is how people who consider themselves good end up supporting harmful systems, not because they are cruel, but because they are afraid to stand apart. They want to do the right thing, but have been taught that right means obedience. And so injustice continues not only through force, but through the quiet compliance of those who look away. Understanding this is not about blaming ourselves. It is about becoming aware. Once we see how we are conditioned to follow, we can begin to choose more consciously. True strength is not in blind obedience, but in thoughtful resistance, in listening to our conscience, even when it leads us away from the crowd, in learning to say no, not with anger, but with clarity and integrity. Healing from fear, recovering after losing ourselves. Living in fear for too long changes a person. It narrows the mind, hardens the heart, and numbs the soul. In oppressive systems, fear becomes a constant background noise. It shapes our choices, our relationships, and even our identity. We begin to forget who we were before fear taught us to hide. We adjust, we shrink, and eventually we mistake survival for living. But healing is possible. It begins when we gently confront the part of ourselves that gave in to fear, not with judgment, but with compassion. We understand that we were trying to protect ourselves in the only way we knew. And from that understanding, we begin to rebuild. Slowly, we reclaim our voice, our truth, our ability to feel and connect. We remember what it means to stand with integrity, even if we once walked away from it. Healing does not mean forgetting. It means integrating the pain into something meaningful. It means learning to trust again, to speak again, to show up in the world with presence and courage. Sometimes this process is lonely. Sometimes it is slow, but it is real. And it begins the moment we choose to stop living by fear and start living by truth. There is no single path to healing. For some, it may come through art, for others, through silence, prayer, or conversation. What matters is the return, the quiet decision to come home to oneself, to no longer abandon who we are just to feel safe, to live again, not as we were forced to, but as we are meant to. Understanding others, to forgive, and freeing ourselves. To truly heal, we must learn to see others not just through the lens of their actions, but through the pain that shaped them. Many who participated in harmful systems were once afraid, confused, or broken. They were not always evil. They were often lost. When we begin to understand this, forgiveness becomes possible, not as an excuse, but as a release. Forgiveness is not forgetting. It is not saying what happened was acceptable. It is choosing not to carry the weight of anger any longer. It is choosing freedom over resentment. When we understand others, we begin to see their humanity beneath the roles they played. And in doing so, we reclaim our own. This does not mean we ignore injustice. It means we do not let it define us. We hold others accountable, but we no longer allow their actions to poison our spirit. Forgiveness is not about them. It is about us. It is about choosing a peace over pain, clarity over bitterness, and growth over blame. Understanding others takes courage. It requires that we open our hearts even after they have been hurt. It asks us to listen, not to agree, but to see. And in that seeing, something shifts. We stop being prisoners of the past. We step into the present with new strength. True freedom is not just escaping control. It is escaping hatred. It is standing in our own truth without needing to destroy someone else. And when we can forgive, not because they deserve it, but because we deserve peace, we begin to live fully again, not chained to the wounds, but rooted in wisdom. In a world shaped by fear and silence, even the smallest act of truth becomes a spark. Change does not begin with power, but with presence, with a single voice that dares to be honest. When enough of us choose to live that way, not by force, but by clarity and courage, a new kind of world begins to emerge, one rooted not in control, but in human dignity.